called today's episode Being Your Brother's Keeper, and the text we're going to be looking at are the first 8 verses of Deuteronomy chapter 22. The story of Cain and Abel is one of the most well-known stories in the whole of the Bible. In it, we see that Abel was a keeper of sheep and Cain is described as a tiller of the ground. When it came to bringing an offering to the Lord, Cain brought the fruit of the ground, and Abel, we are told, brought the firstborn of his flock. Let me read for you now what the Bible tells us about what the Lord thought of these offerings, and we find that in Genesis chapter 4. And it says, "When its time came to bring an offering to the Lord, Cain brought the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought the firstborn of his flock. The Lord did not respect Cain and his offering, so Cain became very angry. The Lord asked Cain why he was angry, reminding him that if he had done well, he would be accepted." Then after that, if you know the story, you'll know that the text tells us that the two brothers very soon after meet in a field, and well, you probably already know, certainly if you've been with me so far in our studies, that Cain in fact kills Abel. When the Lord is then described as coming upon the scene, he asks Cain this very pointed question, "Where is Abel your brother?" And Cain's response is, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Listen to that answer carefully. First he says, "I don't know." Well, he did know, of course. He had killed his brother, so that first part was a barefaced lie. But what about Cain's follow-up to that question, where he questions the Lord back and says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" What about that? It seems to me that by asking that question, Cain was denying any responsibility, whatever and in whatever way, for his brother. Now, beside the fact that this is the first murder in the Bible, this is also a very clear case of a denial of any responsibility. It asks the question, in fact, it asks it as a denial, saying, does anyone have any responsibility towards anybody else? Now, from a biblical point of view, as the narrative unfolds, I would say it becomes very clear that the opposite is in fact true. In fact, it reveals that if, never mind a nation, but even if a family is to survive, the people must be responsible for one another's well-being. So the point that I want to talk about here is, do we bear responsibility towards other people, and how much so, and what are the boundary of it? Are we indeed our neighbour, our brother's keeper? Now, it's generally accepted by people who believe Scripture that that is the case. We are our brother's keeper from an Old Testament point of view, and we're called to love our neighbour by ourselves, by Christ himself. But let me ask a question. What should that look like in its very specific practical terms? It's one thing to know that in principle you're brother's keeper, meaning that you feel you're responsible in some way towards your neighbour, but what might that look like in everyday life? Well, that's what we're going to think about today, because we see the first application and explanation of what that might mean way back here 3,500 years ago in Deuteronomy chapter 22. In it, we see Moses preaching this sermon to the children of Israel on the east side of the Jordan before they cross the river, and he's explaining how God will instill this principle and thereby enable God's people at one and the same time be cared for, to care for one another, and how God can use that to prosper them once they get over there into that new land. Many Bible experts recognize that in this passage Moses is expounding upon the 10 Commandments given earlier and giving very specific instructions about how people might live them out. And I'm going to suggest that in today's passage, Moses is giving the children of Israel some specific and practical ways to answer Cain's question and say, yes, you actually are your brother's keeper. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, it's great to have you with me again today. Thanks for being here, friends. And I'm going to begin and do what I usually do, which first of all, I'm going to just go through the passage verse by verse. And then at the end, I'll try and pull it all together and think about what it means, and if the New Testament has anything to say about it. So here in verse 1, the very first opening verse, very practical, it says, "If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it. Be sure to take it back to its owner." So this is a command, isn't it? It's simple, it's straightforward. It concerns simple things like an ox or a sheep, something belonging to your neighbour. So, and it says, if you see that fellow Israelite's ox or sheep going astray, well, first of all, it says, don't ignore it. You have some responsibility, it's saying here. So don't conceal the fact that you know where the sheep is. Instead, you are to, if you can, capture it and bring it back to your fellow Israelite. Now, there's a dual command here in this opening verse. The negative side is don't ignore it, and the positive command is return it, bring it back to its owner. Therefore, failure to get involved, not only in helping one's neighbour, failure to act when appropriate is also revealed as wrong here. Continuing in verse 2, a little more flesh is added to the bones. Moses says, "If they do not live near, or you do not know who owns it, take it home with you until they come looking for it, then give it back." So in this case, the other person who owns this animal, well, they're not from the locality, they're not nearby anyway, and you don't know who the owner is. Imagine you find this lost animal. Well, you ask around. In that time, did you lose an ox or a sheep? And everybody that you come into contact initially says no. Well, it's saying here that you don't just get to keep the animal. Instead, you're meant to take it home and keep it until the owner finds you, and then you should restore it to them. So this teaches and widens the principle that part of being our brother's keeper, part of your responsibility towards others, is not only to protect their person, but to protect their property. In this case, it's an ox or a sheep. It also underscores the broader principle that we have responsibilities towards one another to preserve and respect each other's property and well-being. In that culture, the ox is an example of a very valuable piece of property. The ox was the thing that pulled the plough, and while you might have more than one sheep, the ox was a significant part of the potential of the way you could make your living. So these first two verses are clearly talking about property in terms of sheep or oxen. But the next verse now talks about something else, but it's still the same principle. Let's see what verses 3 and 4 say. "Do the same if you find their donkey or cloak or anything else they have lost. Don't ignore it. If you see a fellow Israelite's donkey or an ox fallen on the road, don't ignore that. Help the owner get it to its feet." So it's not just animals, it's other property like cloaks, clothing. When I read this, I think, wow, it sounds a little bit like the lost and found area we had in the church that I used to pastor. But the big point being made here is that we have a responsibility to others. Wherever possible and wherever reasonable, we should keep things that we find until they're claimed. But here, it goes further than that. If you see a situation where an animal has fallen into a ditch, then there is a requirement that God says you should actually stop and help. So again, you are not meant to ignore situations like this. It's trying to embed in this early community the idea of interdependent responsibility. You are to act and help your neighbour, not only to return his property, to protect his property. In this case, it's the obvious example of a sheep or an ox or a donkey falling into a ditch. But notice it widens it to very everyday objects, in this case, a garment. We are to protect and preserve our neighbour's property. This is part of being your brother's keeper, answering Cain's questions. It's about helping him keep and maintain his property. Thereby, this is a concrete expression of the eternal moral principle where we were called upon to love your neighbour as yourself, and to do to them and for them what you would have people do for you. So does this apply today? Well, absolutely, of course it does. Sadly, today we see and hear countless stories of people being hurt or attacked in the streets, and people walk by. Nobody wants to get involved. Sometimes they'll just film it and post it. But this is contrary to what this is all about. As human beings, we have a responsibility to protect others' property, not just their lives. So this passage here deals with stray animals, fallen animals, and even something as straightforward as someone's coat or cloak. But it's meant to be imbibed and become part of our culture as cultures who believe in God. These are meant to become the cultural norms, and these are meant to be the responsibilities recognized in any society that claims to be based on Judeo-Christian principles. Okay, let's move on. Verse 5. A woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. Where does that come from? Out of the blue. This passage has started with concern about someone else's property, and as we see, will actually end with concern for protecting people's life and limb. The others clearly mention and relate to how we are to be our brother's keeper, but now in the middle of these two perspectives, right in the middle, we find a strange verse about clothing. Now, commentators have made all kinds of suggestions about what this means, and let me just for a moment share a few of them with you. One interpretation is that men and women in the ancient world sometimes exchanged clothing during pagan worship rituals. The idea here is that God wants his people to not be associated with this type of pagan worship in this way. So they're forbidden from these sort of clothing, shall we say, practices as a way of keeping themselves distinct and holy from the practices of those around them. Another suggestion is that this commandment is really about the idea of not promoting homosexuality, and the argument is based on the latter part of verse 5, which states that this practice is detested by the Lord. Now, in other passages in the Bible, we see that homosexuality is also described in this way as being detestable to the Lord, thereby leading some commentators to connect the two. However, this term, sometimes abomination, sometimes detestable things, is actually applied to many things in Scripture, not just homosexuality. Therefore, taking this as the main interpretation is not entirely convincing in my estimation. A third suggestion posits that transvestitism and certain forms of homosexuality were again linked to pagan worship and in the use of magical practices that intended to cast spells upon or to harm other people. Now, all of that may be true in itself, but I think that this sits here and its purpose is actually more straightforward than that. The suggestion is this, that God's command is that they are to, in principle, maintain the distinctiveness between the sexes. The idea being that men should look like men and women should look like women, something that was definitely not the case in the pagan tribes that already inhabited the land they were about to go into. So this idea and this interpretation of it instills the idea of preserving the difference between the sexes and aligns with the created order revealed in Genesis right back in chapter 1, where it says God made them male and female. And I think this simple interpretation aligns best with the words of the text. For me, this straightforward interpretation is consistent with the broader biblical context. But then we should ask the question, how do we apply this today? Now, some churches in the 1950s, particularly in America, I believe, suggested that women should never wear trousers. Well, I think you can say that women, of course, do wear trousers and shirts today, but you would only need to ask any tailor and say that women's pants and tops are distinctive in design and shape from men's tops. The key, I think, here is just being recommended to try and avoid absurd extremes and focus on maintaining a clear distinction between the sexes, and really simply not to dress in ways that deliberately send a confusing message. Now, of course, our society today has increasingly blurred the lines between male and female distinctions. It probably started significantly in the 1960s with women wearing trousers to a greater extent, And of course, it progressed a great time to men growing long hair. In fact, it became the mainstream for men in the late 60s and early 70s, and then following along with things like fingernail polish. And then something that's really only become a main thing in the last 25 years is women getting tattoos. Nowadays, it's completely common to see women with tattoos covering their bodies. Now, this doesn't mean, I believe, that today we're to be legalistic, but we simply have to take the plain interpretation. We should present ourselves in our lives in ways that preserve the unique difference between the sexes. So what I'm saying, the Bible says this is how it is, and that this was all part of God's original design. However, this doesn't solve the problem, because, as I mentioned, this verse is sandwiched between two others very distinctive passages, the emphasis being on responsibility for others. So how does that fit into the flow of this passage? Now, it's tricky, this. I confess to you, it's not easy, and you can't be dogmatic about this. But one suggestion is that there doesn't need to be any direct connection between the passage before and afterwards. In modern writing, we will often see people use bullet points, where points don't necessarily need to flow into one another. Each one is standalone. And in fact, in the Bible, there are such sections like that. In fact, the whole book of Proverbs is a great example of that type of teaching. And there are indeed a few places in Paul's writings where people will argue that certain verses are simply to be read like a series of bullet points. Therefore, one option that some people say is that this verse is a simple standalone commandment, an Old Testament version of what I've just described. However, the other possibility is that there is indeed a connection. In the rest of the passage, it's going about your relationship with your neighbour himself, not just as property. And then some say, well, if this is linked to this, how must and might this verse relate to all that's around it? Now, one way to interpret this is to say that by maintaining gender distinctions, you provide an example to the community of God's design for creation revealed right back in the beginnings of all things in Genesis chapter 1. And that in itself protects your neighbour and the entire community. Moving on, it's now going to go back to considering how we are to look after one another, to be our brother or sister, but now it's going to talk about protecting, well, community resources in a very unique and unusual way. It says this, verses 6 and 7. If you come across a bird's nest beside the road, either a tree fallen on the ground, and the mother is sitting on the young or the eggs, do not take the mother with her young. You may take the young, but be sure to let the mother go, so that it might go well with you, and you may have a long life. This seems strange, doesn't it? Again, looking at it for this time of things this way, but you've got to look at it in the context of the time of it was written. It's using this to address an issue and is choosing to give the illustrations of a bird's nest of all things, a nest with young birds or eggs in it. And it's saying, well, apparently you can take the young birds or you can take the eggs, but you must let the mother go. That seems almost weird at first reading to our ears today, I'm sure, for many of us, particularly if you live in a city and particularly if you don't live in a rural community where perhaps you hunt. However, for these people in these desert and semi-arable areas, this would be seen as a very useful, practical example of a principle. You see, this passage in context is actually teaching about protecting the community's resources. You see, by letting the mother go, the mother bird, she can go and lay more eggs. Therefore, that will sustain the food supply. This law teaches the Israelites to not just pounce on things and use those resources up immediately, but to think about the future, perhaps even sacrifice by putting a little aside for the future, for the well-being of the community and the whole environment around them. The focus here, if we were to describe it in modern terminology, is about ensuring a sustainable food supply. By protecting the mother bird, there would be an anticipation that there would be more young birds born and hatched again in the future, which would lead to the blessing of the future community. And it's a small thing used here as a bird and a bird's nest as an example of an absolutely huge principle being established. Okay, verse 8 gives us another command, the last we're going to look at today. And it says, when you build a new house, make a parapet around your roofs so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls off the roof. So, very straightforward, isn't it? You've got to make a parapet or a railing, as these roofs originally were flat roofs and people would gather often in the evening and sit, eat and drink and talk. And this railing was simply a safety measure to try and prevent accidents. So this is not being positioned a legal or a health and safety requirement, as we might call it today, and we all like to moan about it. It's about a biblical principle in the fact that we have a responsibility in being our brother's keeper, in loving our neighbours as ourselves, to try, within reason, to eliminate dangers and protect people in our care. A very modern example of this principle is ensuring that if you're driving people in your car, wear a seatbelt. Now, it's a legal requirement in the UK, but it hasn't always been so. But I remember my father in the 1960s when I was growing up, he used to insist that anyone travelling in his car must buckle up before he would even start the engine. This is the ancient equivalent of this, but here it's the very practical thing of putting a railing on a flat roof as a simple measure to protect others from harm. So, that's the text today. The summary, I think, these commands, instructions, principles revealed in the opening verses of 22 are there ultimately to teach us about our responsibility for the well-being of others, whether even maintaining gender distinctions, whether it be protecting community resources or ensuring other people's safety. We are called to look at all these things, practical things in which we can do this for our neighbours. The point you see being revealed here is the answer to Cain's question, and we're being told, yes, you are your brother's keeper. And the practical reality of that means that we are responsible to protect their property, to protect the environment, to protect the food supply, as well as do our best to preserve life and limb. Or to simply put it, as Jesus put it, we are to love our neighbours as ourselves. Now, if you've listened to me teach through chapters of the Bible before, especially the Old Testament, I often like to look at how it applies in the New Testament. So I looked into this passage and I thought about that, and I think I found a couple of passages which clearly give us some advice on this subject from a New Covenant perspective. I'm going to read to you 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 24 to 29. The context here is eating meat offered to idols. But let's hear what Paul says. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. That's very much in line here. That's how he's positioning what he's about to say. Eat anything sold in the meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If an unbeliever invites you to have a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. For why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? So what's Paul teaching in this passage? It says you have a responsibility for other people, which might include not eating meat offered to idols. The banning of meats or food in principles is not, but when it's clearly been offered as a sacrifice to idols, then you are meant to treat this cautiously. Now, this passage in isolation is often misunderstood, but let me clarify what it means by giving you some more context. Remember, this is all from one letter, and if we go back a couple of chapters to chapter 8 and look at verses 10 to 13, Paul says this. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you, with all your knowledge, eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister, one for whom Christ died, is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way and wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so I will not cause them to fall. Now, some people come to this passage and say it's simply saying you should never eat meat offered to idols, because that in itself will make your brother stumble. However, I think Paul in chapter 10 here is arguing a much wider principle and case. The passage, in fact, makes it clear of the motivation for doing this. It says, if a weaker brother sees you eat it and emboldens him to eat it, and not to complain or judge or offer discernment, as some translations say, but to eat it, then you have responsibility not to do something that causes your brother to fall. The point is that by our actions in life, we are responsible for our brothers or neighbour. The practical application of this in my life was some 25 years ago. I found that God called me into a ministry because of the church I was connected to in a really disadvantaged area. There was huge problems with addiction, mainly alcohol addiction at that time, also drug addiction as well. But I felt that God called me to give up drinking alcohol completely, even moderately, so that I could be not used as an excuse to embolden some people who were struggling with alcohol addiction. And I was trying to pastorally help through Bible studies that I needed to not do anything or have anything in my life which would make my brother to fall. And that's what I think is going on here. The principle might apply in different areas of your life that God's brought you into, but the principle is that you shouldn't be doing something that someone who doesn't know the Lord or is a baby in the Lord might interpret as giving them free rein to do it also. But if you look again into Galatians verse 2, it says that our purpose in doing this is to bear one another's burdens, and therefore by doing that you fulfill the law of Christ. So it's clear enough. We are to bear one another's burdens. We are to love one another as ourselves. Simply put, in the Old Testament context, we are indeed our brother's keeper. But then there's this little addendum in verse 5, for each one shall bear his own load. So Paul here is saying to bear one another's burdens in the way he's described, but in verse 5 he says that everyone should bear their own load. So what's he actually talking about here? What's the difference? What's the boundary, the line that's been set here? Well, the key word is the use of the word burden. It was the same word used of loading a ship. If the ship could bear the burden, then it would bear its own burden. But if it became overloaded, they would have to transfer it to someone else, so that that burden would be bared somewhere else also. So the point I'm trying to make here, I'm not sure how clear I'm being on it, is that yes, we have responsibility for others, but in fact, you can go too far in helping people. You can enable them, they call it today. You can enable them to stay stuck in harmful behaviours. Yes, we should be concerned about people's property. Yes, we should be wanting to protect life and limb. Even the things like the environment and the food supply, these are all ways in which we protect the wider community. But it also saying there's a boundary here, and do not do anything for anybody that they are easily capable of doing for themselves. We are our brother's keeper, but we're not responsible to do things in such a way that it takes away their responsibility to act. You see, this chapter with its diverse commandments underscores the importance of living a life marked by integrity, passion, and responsibility to others. We are called to protect the vulnerable, uphold purity, and honour the sacredness of our relationships with each other and with God. In being our brother's keeper, we are to reflect God's love and righteousness in our actions, whether it's just these simple practical things like returning a lost item, ensuring the safety of others, or even just maintaining our own personal moral purity. Every act of obedience is a testament of our commitment to God's command, and thereby exempling it for other people as a way in which we can care for one another. Knowing that in doing that, we not only fulfill God's law, but we also communicate a community that is rooted in love and holiness in every way. Thanks for being with me today. Friends, welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast, a journey through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. You're joining us in the closing week or so of our journey through the book of Deuteronomy. And today I'm going to be looking at the passage Deuteronomy chapter 22 from verses 9 through to verse 30 at the end of that chapter. And I've called today's discussion the seventh commandment. You know, the Lord gave Moses 10 commandments, didn't he? These commandments are probably the most widely known ethical code in all of human history. However, although wide-ranging, they can appear at times to be very general. Maybe it would be helpful if Moses had provided some specific application for each of these commandments on how they might be played out in the real world. Well, in essence, that I believe is what he does in the book of Deuteronomy. Many Bible teachers over the years have suggested that this part of Deuteronomy, the part we're studying at the moment, the second lengthy sermon in his series of 3 sermons that he gives to the people before entering the land, in it, Moses is in effect explaining and expanding on that which was given in the 10 Commandments. Today's passage is Deuteronomy chapter 2, beginning at verse 9, where I believe it deals specifically with the 7th commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. So what we're looking for today in this chapter of Deuteronomy is Moses' specific application of this 7th commandment. Now, what intrigues me about this passage is it clearly addresses sexual immorality, sexual sin, certainly in the second half of what we're going to look at today. But it begins with something that doesn't really seem related to sexual immorality at all. Instead, it seems to, in an unusual way, highlight themes of separation, putting aside holiness, purity. That's very evident, especially in the first part of the passage we're going to look at. However, I believe, as we'll discover, that as it continues on its journey into morality and the issue of sexual immorality, then the command, you shall not commit adultery, rises to the fore. Because it's really addressing the mixing of people in many ways in which they should not mix. The Israelites are going to be told they need to do and keep certain things and to keep them separate. And adultery is added on and viewed simply as a form of impurity in all aspects of life, of mixing these things that shouldn't be mixed in aspects not just of marriage, but in the family, the social, the political, the religious, and even the spiritual life of everyone and everything. So that's the plan today, and welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, I'm going to dive straight into the text today, friends, beginning with Deuteronomy 22 verse 9, where it says, do not plant 2 kinds of seeds in your vineyard. If you do, not only the crops you plant, but also the fruit of the vineyard will be defiled. Now, before I comment on this verse itself, let me remind you of a similar statement in Leviticus 19:19, which told us, you shall not sow your field with mixed seed. So the meaning of these 2 verses is clear. You shouldn't mix seeds in the same plot of ground. But there's a deeper significance going on here. The key word is the idea of purity, avoiding things becoming defiled, applying this text to the idea of the purity of Scripture and lining it up with the purity of the people. You see, all of this is going to focus on the concept of purity. The idea here initially is simply to keep seeds separate in order to maintain both the crops and the fruit of the crops separate in order to maintain purity. Now, if that in itself isn't challenging, maybe even confusing enough, look at the next verse, which says, "Do not plough with an ox and a donkey yoked together." Okay, very practical, very specific. And again, Leviticus 19 verse 19 also says, "You shall not let your livestock breed with another kind." So the idea is simple here. It's all about not yoking two different animals together. Now, some people have pointed out, very helpfully, I think, that if two animals like this are put together on the same yoke, they not only step and walk at a different rate, but the pulling angles of the two beasts are unequal. So they were going to pull the plough at different rates. They're not going to be effective. They're maybe not going to be able to do what you want them to do at all. But be that as it may, these opening verses are clearly saying some very practical things about not mixing seeds and not mixing animals. Now, are you confused yet at what has this all got to do with the seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery"? Well, let's move on to the next verse and see if we get even more confused. It says, "Do not wear clothes of wool and linen woven together." Again, Leviticus 19 said something almost exactly the same. In verse 19 it says, "Nor shall a garment of mixed linen and wool come upon you." So although not exactly the same, very clearly you can see that these two verses are very similar in what they're trying to get across. In fact, in some translations, the wording used is identical between these two chapters. Well, what's the point of this one? Well, again, the commentators suggest that it is teaching the principle that God is a God of separation, and he's using these physical examples. And by doing so, he's teaching the people to separate themselves from sin and defilement. So again, it is the basic idea of separation is the thing that leads to purity. Now, some also look at these verses and actually point out that it also was a reference to the pagan priests at that time who wore garments mixed with wool and linen. But if you look at the Levitical dress codes, you will see that they never mixed garments in that way. So what's going on here? No mixing of seeds, animals, clothes. This is all clearly at what we call an object lesson on separation and implied purity. In fact, Deuteronomy 22 verses 9 to 11 and Leviticus 19 verse 19 use these same phrases and illustrations as object lessons. But interestingly, in both passages, Moses then goes on to talk about sexual sin immediately afterwards. Now, you've heard me use this term object lessons, but let me suggest that these examples are what truly object lessons are. Forget the modern application of that phrase you hear bandied about today. This is where the term originally really comes from in our Bibles. It's an occasion where, through teaching, sometimes in the Old Testament, sometimes through Jesus, through the parables, sometimes a physical object is used to remind us of something spiritual. These are the clear original object lessons, perhaps used for the first time in literature here way back in Deuteronomy over 3,500 years ago. So with that in mind, let's move on to the final verse of this opening part of the passage, where in verse 12 it says, "Make tassels on the four corners of your cloaks to wear." So where and why is Moses coming up with these very specific rules, even down to having tassels on your clothes? In fact, if you look today, there are some branches of Orthodox Judaism where people still walk around today with these tassels on their clothes. They still follow this practice. But rather than focus on the practice, we need to think about what's the meaning behind it. Now, the purpose of these tassels is not stated here in Deuteronomy, but it is explained and was explained both to the Israelite people and to us previously when we looked at Numbers chapter 15. In verses 38 to 40, it tells us this: "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corner of your garments, with a blue cord at each tassel. You will have these tassels to look at, and so you will remember all the commands of the Lord, that you may obey him and not prostitute yourself by chasing after the lusts of your hearts and eyes. Then you will remember to obey all my commandments and will be consecrated to the Lord. So again, these tassels, they're an object lesson. They were meant to stand as a physical reminder to keep God's commandments. Okay, let's remind ourselves of what we've got by looking at these 4 opening verses of what we're looking at today, 9 through 12. This passage starts off by telling us, separate the seeds, separate the animals, separate the kinds of cloth you use to clothes on your body, and then put tassels on your clothes. All, if you just approach them as a standalone passage, all seemingly unimportant, all seemingly, one might even say, meaningless in themselves from a New Testament perspective. But the important thing here is to understand that these commands are being given to emphasize separation and purity and to set the scene for what's about to follow. Because immediately following these physical examples of separation, Moses will address types of sexual sin, making the point that we too are to separate ourselves from this type of sexual sin, and that is the way we can maintain purity in our own lives. And the rest of chapter 22, verses 13 to 30, will address 5 specific cases of sexual immorality, providing concrete applications of the 7th commandment, you shall not commit adultery. Now, before we launch out on these, to modern ears, these are going to be very challenging. But if you simply think that as an individual, you are going and choose to live a life of simple sexual immorality, not being sexually active outside of marriage, then all of these fall into place easily. Okay, let's look at the first of these 5 specific illustrations, way in which Moses unpacks the basic commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And the first deals with those who falsely accuse someone else of infidelity. Here it goes. Verses 13 to 19. If a man takes a wife, and after sleeping with her dislikes her, and slanders her, and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her, I did not find proof of her virginity, then the young woman's father and mother shall bring to the town elders at the gate the proof that she was a virgin. Her father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin. But here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the young woman's father, because the man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. Now, let me just say before we say anything, it would have been unimaginable at that time and almost unheard of for a young woman to be anything other than a virgin upon marriage. And of course, women married young in those days, perhaps around the age of 14. And in this situation, it's saying if a man accuses this new wife of not being a virgin, that is a very serious thing. And to respond to that, her parents are to provide evidence of her virginity to the city elders. And if the accusation is proved false in that way or any other way, then the husband will face consequences, serious consequences, 3 consequences. Now, the exact nature of the punishment is not specified, but many say it would be whipped 40 times, because that is what was suggested if you read Deuteronomy chapter 25. But also the husband must pay a fine. The husband must pay 100 shekels of silver to the woman's father because she brought a bad name upon this woman. And that amount, interestingly, is double, twice the bride price that would have originally been paid. Furthermore, the man is not allowed to divorce this woman. He has to stay with her and look after her for the rest of his life, regardless of his feeling towards her. So the emphasis is both on protecting the woman's reputation and protecting her financial status and ensuring justice if anyone is falsely accused in this terrible way. Also, a man cannot simply use a circumstance like this as a way to manipulate a divorce or to get a divorce in a whim. This means that if a husband falsely accuses his wife, he cannot just dismiss her. The case must be brought before the elders of the city, the equivalent of our modern day court system, and they will determine whether the accusation is valid. So in this scenario, the husband has been seen to lie about his wife. But what if that occasion turns out to be true? Well, look at the next couple of verses. If, however, the charge is true, and no proof of the young woman's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of the town shall stone her to death. She has done an outrageous thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge such evil from among you. Okay, if this accusation is true and the woman is found guilty, then Deuteronomy tells us she faces severe consequences. And it also gives us the reasons for these punishments. A, she's committed sexual immorality. She's engaged in premarital sex, done it as a woman living in her father's house. She's deceived her husband because she's lied about her virginity, and she's deceived her father and dishonored the father by behaving in this promiscuous way. The harsh penalty at this time is death, and it underscores the seriousness of sexual immorality in the Old Testament at that time. In fact, it's equating it with the severity of murder, since these are two of only a very few things that are said to warrant the death penalty in the Old Testament. From a scriptural perspective, in Levitical law, sex is considered the consummation of marriage and is not to be participated in any way before marriage. I'll comment more on that later. Secondly, moving on to verse 22, another example is given. If a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge this evil from Israel. If a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her, you shall take both of them to the gate of the town and stone them to death. The young woman, because she was in town and did not scream for help, and the man, because he violated another young man's potential wife, you must purge the evil from among you. So here, in this passage, it addresses the clear-cut case of adultery. If a married person is caught in the act, both parties involved are to be put to death. Now, the method of execution is not specified at this time, but like other passages, many suggest stoning would have been the common practice. This is further illustrated in the New Testament story in John chapter 8, where a woman caught in adultery is nearly stoned until Jesus intervenes, therefore under the New Testament showing that grace always covers the law. But the severe punishment demonstrated here in the Pentateuch shows the serious view of adultery held in the Old Testament, emphasizing the absolute need to purge such things from this newly emerging community, to make it different, the tribes, the nations around them. The penalty here is death, again, very much clearly, in the most brutal ways, reinforcing the sanctity of marriage. Now, it's worth noting that you will see here there's a distinction between what we might call fornication, sexual activity, and adultery. Fornication is a broad term used in the Old Testament encompassing all forms of unlawful sexual activity outside of marriage. Adultery, however, specifically refers to sexual relations where one or two parties are married to someone else, and that distinction still stands to this day. So that's two situations we've considered, but there are additional cases to cover. The third covers the abomination of rape, verses 25 to 27. But if out in the country a man happens to meet upon a young woman pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done that shall die. Do nothing to the woman. She has committed no sin deserving death. The case is like that of someone who attacks and murders a neighbour. For a man who found the young woman out in the country and thought she betrothed woman may have screamed, but there was no one to rescue her. Now, consensual sexual relationship between betrothed man and woman in the city, not explicitly mentioned here but mentioned earlier, is still relevant. If it happens in the city, one of the key factors in determining the guilt was whether the woman cried out or not. If she did not cry out, both parties are considered guilty and to be stoned. This implies that the woman's silence indicates consent. Now, that's troubling when we hear that today, but in, of course, that time, the idea being that women from birth would have been told that in the event of something happening like this, they should cry out. And if this event happened in the city, it would be heard. But if in the country, it could not be heard. Even if the woman cried out, it would not necessarily be heard. Therefore, in the country, she must be given the benefit of the doubt. Okay, next situation. If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver, and he must marry the woman, for he has violated her, and he can never divorce her as long as he lives. Now we come to a case that again is underscoring the same principle, but this time the man must marry the woman and never be allowed to divorce her, forever creating a commitment between him and her. Now, though difficult to understand by today's perspective, if you think a little bit behind this is there likely to serve as a deterrent upon a man who wants to behave in this way, who consider raping, because it creates significant consequences for his actions. Not just spiritual, but financial as well. And then finally, the fifth case which I find particularly interesting, due to its modern ramifications, still applied in our legal system to this day, and it's found in the closing verse 30, where it simply says, a man is not to marry his father's wife, he must not dishonour his father's bed. Now, we need to pause and consider this phrase carefully. The phrase his father's wife is actually referring to a stepmother, not a biological mother. That distinction is clear in some of our modern translations, but in the original language in which it is written, it is clear. The implication is that the man has married and is his father's second wife. Perhaps he was a widower. And this act is still defined as incest according to Scripture, and God forbids it. The term uncovers his father's bed is simply a euphemism for engaging in sexual intercourse with her. Now, what makes this case particularly noteworthy is its mention in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul addresses a very similar situation in the church there. And he writes this: it is actually reported that there is sexual immorality amongst you, and of the kind that even the pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife. Are you proud? Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning than put out of the fellowship this man who has been doing this? So Paul is expressing his shock that such a sin is present within this Christian community. A sin so grievous that not even the non-believers around them would engage in such things, he says. He says they should be in mourning about this. In fact, he instructs the church to, as he describes it, deliver this man to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so his spirit may be saved on the day of the Lord. So the New Testament punishment for this is excommunication, paralleling the Old Testament penalty of death for similar offences, reflecting still the severity with which God views this and all such types of sexual immorality. Okay, let's try and sum this chapter up. The Lord here commands the children of Israel to live lives that are separate from sin, particularly in matters of sexual purity. Why does God seem to be and why are the punishments so much harsher for certain types of sin? Because certain types of sin don't just affect the individual, but they undermine the community and the family. So the specific sexual sins mentioned here in the second part of the passage include not only adultery, which is the obvious one, but also any type of sexual relations, fornication outside of marriage, rape, and even incest. So the seventh commandment, that basic general commandment, you shall not commit adultery, is now extended way beyond mere adultery to encompass these other sexual sins. The initial commandments at the beginning of the passage about separating seeds, animals, and cloth and clothing are meant to serve as object lessons in maintaining purity, which he is about to expand upon in the second part of the passage. Just as these very basic physical items are to be kept separate in order to maintain this concept of purity, so should individuals maintain sexual purity until and within marriage. Therefore, the passage is meant to carry a much broader lesson than just what appears on the surface. Sex is meant to be for marriage, and individuals should keep themselves pure until that time and after it, thereby honouring their married relationship, loving their wife, loving their husband, and cleaving only unto them. This principle of separation and purity, practically described here, is not only for young people. The modern church loves to focus on young people these days and tell them how they shouldn't be indulging in these types of things. But it is very clearly here focusing on all people, and its focus on marriage, divorce, adultery, fornication outside of marriage, seems to me to be focusing on every generation in order to give them guidelines by which we all might maintain and live holy lives dedicated to God. By separating ourselves from sin, by maintaining purity in all the area of our lives, we therefore honour God's commandments and live in a way that will reflect His holiness, not only within our own family situation, but to other people. And through that, God can truly bless us. You see, God's standard for holiness remains unchanged. The administration and the application of the punishment may have changed, but whether in the Old Testament or the New Testament, the spiritual call to purity and separation from sin is still remaining a central theme, urging us to live our lives in ways that reflect this aspect of God's righteousness and holiness to all who might see it. Thanks for being with me today. Welcome friends, I've called today's episode Keeping Things Spiritually Clean, and we're going to be looking at the first half of Deuteronomy chapter 23, verses 1 to 18 in fact. In Hamlet, Shakespeare poses that very famous question, I'm sure we all know it, to be or not to be. Well, with all due respect to William, I'd like to borrow and modify his line, because today the question I am going to ask is to allow or not to allow. Because this, I believe, captures what Moses is addressing here in Deuteronomy 23. Moses is clearly saying to us here that certain things need to be excluded, but there are also other things that need to be included in our nations and in the life of God's people. That's the plan, so welcome to today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, welcome friends. Let's begin. I'm going to read the verses pretty much one by one, unpack them, and then try and pull it all together for us. So let's begin with verse 1, where it says, "No one who has been emasculated by crushing or cutting may enter the assembly of the Lord." A couple of cryptic messages here. One is the term assembly of the Lord. That is referring to the formal gathering of Israel in its form of public worship. So it's not just the people generally, it's when they come together as a worshipping community. And it says, let's be clear, the other translations probably say it more clearly, men who have damaged their sexual genitalia were not allowed to participate in these public worship ceremonies. Now that seems a weird exclusion as a basis for attending a public worship service, doesn't it? Now please note, it's not saying that individuals could not be part of the wider believing community, maybe even loving the Lord, serving the Lord, and receiving eternal life. But what's going on here, the Bible experts tell us, is it represents one of these of many symbolic calls for the people to appear whole, pure, and separated to God, as a metaphor, a real world walking, talking metaphor of how we need to be pure and unsullied before the Lord. Additionally, it's worth bearing in mind that this inclusion would have been also a warning to prevent the influence of this common pagan practice of castration among the Canaanite religions in the area at that time, of allowing that perspective to infiltrate and influence the worship life of Israel by these pagan practices from the Canaanite religions in the land they're about to enter into. But there's a second group to be excluded, and they're mentioned almost straight away in verse 2. No one born of a forbidden marriage, nor of any of their descendants, may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. Now note the language here, and it's used carefully, and we need to read it carefully. This is not talking specifically about children born to single-parent mothers. I've heard it taught in that way, but if you look at the text, it's very clearly saying to those born within forbidden marriages. So this is likely talking about things like those born of incest or adulterous unions, but particularly those between adulterous on both levels, between the Israelites, between individual people, but also between the cultures, Israelite and the Canaanites. The aim is to discourage, obviously, incest, but also what we would today call interfaith marriages, not between believers and non-believers, between believers and those who believed something else. Verse 3 adds a little more detail and addresses the Ammonites and the Moabites. And it says, no Ammonite or Moabite or any of their descendants may enter the assembly of the Lord, not even in the 10th generation. Now, the phrase to the 10th generation is hyperbole. It's a term, simply a way of saying that this can't be done ever. And the reason for their exclusion is their hostility towards Israel. Remember, during the Exodus story, they actually hired Balaam to curse Israel. Now, as we consider these, let's face it, challenging verses, let's understand that while that we today are not under the Mosaic law, the principles underpinning all this of holiness, purity, and separation from sin, I believe still remain vital. It will, of course, be administered in a different way under the New Testament law of grace. But still, we should and can strive to live lives that are marked by the values that have been signposted here, being wholly dedicated to the Lord, whilst at the same time not necessarily saying we have to have any of these physical exclusions shown here applying in our faith communities today. This all goes back to the Israelites, remember, coming out of Egypt, where they encountered problems with these tribes on their journeys, with the Ammonites and the Moabites, who did not in any way show them hospitality during their time wandering in the wilderness. In fact, on occasions they battled against them. And you might remember that one of the important stories is how one of these groups of people even hired a guy called Balaam to curse them, but the Lord in that story actually turns that curse into a blessing. Now, here's another point worth drawing attention to. In the original text here, the Hebrew text, Ammonites and Moabites, the words used are the masculine gender. So it actually means male Ammonites and Moabites cannot enter the assembly of the Lord, which therefore means clearly females can. And this is significant because we will see later that Ruth, who is declared to be a Moabitess, will be allowed to enter Israel and even marry an Israelite. In fact, she will become part of the family line of Jesus the Messiah by doing so. So let's be clear, it's the Amorite and Moabite men who are excluded for integrating with the nation of Israel. And this is because ultimately of their hostility towards Israel. And because of that, the male Ammonites and Moabites are not allowed to participate. And remember, it's talking about exclusions from Israel's public worship in any way. And the next few verses explain a little more of the background and why the stipulation has been put in place. It says, "For they did not come to meet you with bread and water, on your way when you came out of Egypt, and they hired Balaam son of Peor from Pethor in Aram Naharaim to pronounce a curse on you. However, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but turned their curse into a blessing, because the Lord your God loves you. I've already covered that, haven't I? But there it is in the text. Then verse 6 states, you shall not seek their peace, nor their prosperity all of your days, forever. So God commands Israel never to try and seek peace or in any way create treaties to bring about prosperity with these hostile nations around them at that time. So to sum all of this up so far, men who have emasculated themselves or been emasculated for ritual worship reasons, and Ammonite and Moabite men are to be excluded from the assembly of the Lord, the worshipping community of faith of the Lord. But now look at verse 7. Do not, however, despise an Edomite, for the Edomites are related to you. Do not despise an Egyptian, because you resided as foreigners in their country. So despite the exclusion of these others so far, the Edomites and the Egyptianites apparently are to be treated different. Edomites were considered brothers because indeed they were descendants of Esau, Jacob's brother. And the Egyptians, despite having enslaved the Israelites, perhaps the underpinning idea is that for many generations they did indeed provide a place for this nation to live in and among. And then verse 8 closes his opening set of exclusions in relation to people and nations by saying the third generation of children born to them may enter the assembly of the Lord. So it means that not only can they become part of the general nation, as it were, the wider nation of Israel, after 3 generations, the descendants of the Edomites and even the descendants of the Egyptians would be allowed to participate in this assembly of the Lord, the worshipping community. Now, I would say I agree with many of the commentators I read around this passage, which suggests that the degree of flexibility being inbuilt here in its approach to different groups signals that they were intended not just to teach what is plainly said in them, but to, in a sense, be allowed to be stretched, to signal, to signpost, to teach broader principles. For example, eunuchs, because they were castrated for pagan religious purposes in the main, were excluded only because there was a need to emphasize for the need for worshippers in that sense to be symbolically perfect before the Lord. So that's the first 8 verses of this passage, and it's dealing with here various bars that stop people from entering not the wider nation of Israel, but the assembly of the Lord. But the unusual, almost counterintuitive thing is that Edomites and Egyptians were included, highlighting this theme I've said. But what's going on here is it's all about asking the question to allow or not to allow. Moses is laying out these guidelines for inclusion and exclusion, teaching that while some are absolutely to be excluded, others are to be included, and there's a flexibility in the approach to this. Okay, that's the first situation, all encompassed in those first 8 verses. Let's look at the second one, which is about an army keeping clean, keeping uncleanliness out of the military camp. And verse 9 tells us, when you're encamped against your enemies, keep away from everything impure. Remember, Moses is delivering these laws out with a series of sermons on the east side of the Jordan. Laws that they are being told they need to obey as they enter the promised land, which is going to happen very soon. And one of these laws is that when the army goes out to battle, they too are to keep themselves from every impure thing. Imagine using this as a sort of text for a military group today. Some armies would attempt to do that. It's going to tell us that when they're away from home, they're going to face all kinds of temptations. And this verse is a simple yet powerful reminder. If you're in the army, be careful that you don't involve yourself in any type of wicked behavior, and also keep a focus on your personal as well as your spiritual cleanliness. But having set it up as a warning to be careful to avoid wicked things, everything impure, naturally we'd think, okay, what's going to follow here is a lesson on sexual morality. But Moses initially takes a different approach. Listen to verse 10 and 11. If one of your men is unclean because of a nocturnal emission, he is to go outside the camp and stay there. But as evening approaches, he is to wash himself, and at sunset he may return to the camp. Now here we're clearly talking about an army and a military camp. If a man here, as the King James Version puts it, has some sort of unclean occurrence in the night, he is to go outside the camp until evening, wash with water, and only then may he return. I think it's important to note that the Bible commentators that I read in the most suggested that this is not just referring to the issue of semen, as some certainly seem to suggest. Certainly I heard that a version of it which focused on this when I was growing up as a young man. But my reading of it falls in line with what I've seen in most of the modern commentators, that this passage is meant to cover all natural, and how shall we say it, unnatural forms of human biological function that might occur during the night. Simply going out and needing, how is it you Americans put it, you need to use the restroom. Anyway, verse 12 unpacks it a little more. Also it says, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside you shall dig with it and cover your refuse. How incredibly practical is this? Essentially saying that every single soldier has to carry a shovel in which they can dig a little hole for using the bathroom, as it were, and then cover it up. And this, of course, is a very literal practice, but it's also meant to signify some things in a symbolic way, emphasizing the importance of cleanliness and separation of the unclean from that which is clean. And very definitely the Israelites regarded human waste products as rightly unclean. We know that today. But that wasn't always the case, you know. One Bible commentator I read in this passage pointed out that much of the information that is found today in ancient medical texts did indeed use these, how shall I say, hazardous materials, such as human feces and donkey feces, to treat injuries and splinters, was one that I read about. So the Bible instructions being offered here kind of went against contemporary practices. And it's interesting that in the light of history, most of what's discussed here has been shown to completely align with what modern science and health would later confirm. Another example of this we find way back when Abraham was told to circumcise Isaac on the 8th day. That's all well and good, but we now know today, science has proved that blood clotting factors, particularly something called vitamin K, peak in newborn children around about the 8th day after birth, making it the optimal time for such a procedure to take place. Isn't that interesting? And there are many other examples that demonstrates God's wisdom in providing, how shall we say it, sanitary and health-conscious instructions, whilst at the same time symbolically using these practices to teach separation from uncleanliness. So these verses in Deuteronomy are very clearly not only providing practical guidelines for cleanliness and health, but they also taught the Israelites the principles about holiness and separation of impure things from pure things. And God's instructions here, highly practical. Each soldier simply carry a shovel with their weapons for the sanctification and sanitation of the camp. Without mincing my words, putting it very plainly, all excrement was to be placed outside the camp and covered immediately with dirt or soil. And one commentator I read also noticed that if armies throughout history had simply followed these simple regulations, then they would have avoided the many plagues that devastated armies for thousands of years, many would say right up until the early 20th century and what is today called the Great War, World War I. And I find that fascinating. Anyway, let's move on to the next verse, which starts with the word, have you noticed, for? Now, I don't know how many times I've said this to you before, but when you see the word for at the beginning of a biblical verse or sentence, it means it's important because the writer is about to explain or illustrate everything he's just said previously. And here we see Moses explain why they should do this, even this practical thing of covering up their own mess in the night. And it says, you should do this because the Lord your God walks in your midst in your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may not see no unclean things among you, and turn away from you. Now, I've mentioned that these instructions are meant to be ultimately symbolic. God wants Israelite to be holy and separated unto him, and this cleanliness was to be a symbol of that separation unto him. So it isn't just about sanitation, although that is part of it. It's about recognizing God's presence among them and maintaining holiness. And it is too for us. By living a life that is honoring to God and holy in this way, it's about recognizing that God's presence is amongst us all the time. Fact, while nocturnal emissions and burying excrement aren't moral issues, they are the things that could render a person ceremonially unclean at that time. By obeying these regulations, Israelite soldiers were reminded, and we're meant to be reminded, friend, not just of God's holiness, but God's omnipresence, that God is with us even in the most private of moments. And verse 14 emphasizes for us that God walks in our midst. So we're meant to be holy all the time. And I think that this spiritual lesson of these verses is to underscore for you and I the importance of simply being aware of the Lord's presence and his holiness, his presence with you and among you at all times. Now, I'll just pause at this point and reiterate a crucial point. The commands in this passages are primarily ceremonial and symbolic, but also clearly we've seen they offer practical benefits. There are benefits to obeying scriptures above the obvious. Consider this. The Bible aims to guide you ultimately towards a Christ-like life and Christ-like spiritual maturity. If you followed, for example, Ephesians, it actually promises that if you do what it says in the book, promises you'll grow to Christ-like maturity. And you'll experience not just spiritual benefits from that, but more than that, living by the teachings of the New Testament, or for that matter, any other scriptures, bring for us emotional, mental, psychological, and spiritual benefits. Imagine living your life in the New Testament way, which stands not only as a testimony to the power of God to save you, but to guide you towards a balanced, peaceful, Christ-like life. That's its main aim. Friends, there are profound benefits to simply doing what the Lord says. All right, I said we're going to mention 4 situations today. So far, we've only looked at 2. Let's pick up the pace again. Verse 15, and remember the whole point here is whether we are to lie or not allow. And we've talked about things that we're not allowing, certain things. Now let's talk about something which we're allowed. Verses 15 and 16 say, "You shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst, in the place where he chooses, within one of your gates, where it seems best to him, and you shall not oppress him." Now, most scholars believe this is going to refer to the non-Israelite slave, the one who has fled from their Canaanite master once they've entered the land, and how some of them might come and seek refuge with the Israelites. The question is, should they allow them to stay, or should they not? Remember, the theme of these whole verses is about inclusion and exclusion, and Moses is asking the question, do you send him back or keep him, this runaway slave? Well, verse 16 elaborates and tells us he may live wherever he chooses and whatever's best to him, and you're not to act unfairly to him in any way. So the Israelites here are commanded to show compassion to those who were oppressed, and it's no different here in this practical example of it. Now, remember, so far we've discussed exclusions that are there, things that we should not do, and we do that in order to maintain our holiness. But now we're seeing an example of inclusion, but please note it is driven by compassion. The Israelites are told not only to allow this to happen, but to keep and protect those who had formerly been mistreated. One commentator I read noted that returning a slave back to its master was a very common practice at that time. In fact, treaties in the ancient and Near East provided provision for the returning of escaped slaves. However, the law here that's been unpacked for Israel in Moses' sermon is reminding them that their primary treaty is with the Lord, not with any other people or nations. And I think there's an undercurrent here reminding them of their own history, remember, of very recently, just a generation ago, themselves being former slaves in Egypt. And the point is clear. When they enter the land, if they see a slave running to find sanctuary with them who has been mistreated by the nature of the tribes they've been enslaved by in this land, they don't need to send them back. They can keep them. Therefore, what we see here is to allow or not to allow has this moral component attached to it, that things can be allowed based on a morality decision based on the individual situation. Okay, that's the third. Let's look at our fourth and final situation today, beginning in verse 17. No Israelite man or woman is to become a shrine prostitute. You must not bring the earnings of a female prostitute or a male prostitute into the house of the Lord your God to pay any vow, because the Lord your God detests them both. So this is initially referring to religious prostitution. Now, in the ancient world, prostitution was very much part of the pagan religious practices, not only in this part of the world, but right across the whole ancient world. For example, in Corinth in Greece, at that time or shortly afterwards, there was a pagan temple where, believe it or not, 1,000 prostitutes worked there among a population probably no more than about 70,000 people. And these 1,000 women were participating in religious worship, in rituals which would meant engaging in prostitution, and the men, by enacting their religious life, would be involved with prostitution, sexual acts with women, many of whom, most commentators agree, would have had no choice in this matter, and this practice was common all across the ancient world at this time. But verse 17 explicitly forbids any form of ritual prostitution among the Israelites. But then notice it says they're not to allow their sons and daughters to become this type of prostitutes, initially as a way aimed to prevent Israelites again from adopting these heinous foreign religious practices and to keep their type of worship revealed to them in the Levitical law, pure and unsullied. I think I have to be honest and say we know, as we'll continue to work through the Bible, that there are sadly examples where they fail to obey this command, leading to their contamination, even to this level of temple prostitution. Also, the really important thing I think to notice in this passage is there is also a wider shift of focus from the ritual religious prostitution, so to speak, to prostitution in general, including male prostitution. So the offence of what we in the UK today call living off immoral earnings, pimping you might describe it, is very clearly outlawed here in the biblical text. Using this type of money earned in this way through sinful means is wrong, and it becomes acutely doubly wrong when it's used to pay a vow. That type of money seen to be offered to God is seen to be particularly detestable, an abomination, totally unacceptable. So here we see these commands, these last two examples are given not only for ceremonial and symbolic reasons, but because they will have practical and, more importantly, moral implications. The Israelite nation were to be distinct in their practices, maintaining their purity and holiness in not only their worship, but their practical everyday lives. And taking that, widening it to a general principle, clearly any form of insincere or hypocritical actions are detestable to the Lord. In the context here, it's money gained from prostitution, but it's how all these types of things need to be excluded from what we might call God's society, if that's a reasonable way of putting it, because these things should not be used in any way to suggest that we can give that sort of stuff to the Lord. So to understand the overall message here, I think it's helpful to revisit the initial question, which was to allow or not to allow, what to allow and what not to allow. And so far, let me remind you, we've examined 4 situations. Rules around the assembly, the community of faith, where we saw that certain groups were barred from entering the assembly of the Lord. And then we saw some rules around military camps and how uncleanliness was to be eliminated from the military camps, both symbolically and practically. And then there was some guidelines around how to deal with fleeing or returning slaves, escaping slaves from when they go into the land were to be accepted, welcomed into the community, allowed to be part of it, and not oppressed or taken advantage of in any way. And then there are these rules around ritual and religious prostitution and prostitution in general, and how it is all forbidden, including the situation where people are earning money from prostitution, how that was wrong, and how you must never use that type of money for offerings to the Lord. So these points are meant to illustrate the principle of simply maintaining holiness. But did you notice that lined within that there's an undercurrent of showing compassion to the oppressed? You see, the Lord wants his people to be holy, but he also wants them to be compassionate towards others who are persecuted, who are in need. So I'd like to close by breaking down the lessons from this passage into what I believe the main principles are. And I think there are three. First of all, very clearly, right up front, there is a call to eliminate uncleanliness. And that includes excluding unclean people. Now, the New Testament is seen to echo this within that chapter on church discipline from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul comments clearly about what is correct and incorrect personal conduct. Bad company, being allowed into the fellowship, the community of faith, will ruin good habits among good people and create bad habits among those which were previously good people. So the call is carried over into the New Testament for the community of faith to separate itself from uncleanliness. But then, secondly, there is this issue about how we're all called to be holy. We're all called to choose to set ourselves apart from the Lord, and we're called to do that because he wants to walk with us. He wants to be in the midst with us as communities and in our hearts as individuals. But to allow this to happen, that's always going to involve a level of obedience to his commands. And then underpinning that, there's that subtext, if you like, about being compassionate, showing compassion to those who are oppressed, as seen and encapsulated in the treatment of these escaped slaves, and prohibitions included against exploiting any vulnerable people. How might we summarize such a group of laws like this? Well, I think the Lord did it beautifully for it when he said simply, we are to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. So I'm going to conclude today by quoting from you one of my favorite books in the New Testament, because I think James chapter 1, the closing verses of it, illustrate this point very well. Verse 20 states that human wrath does not produce the righteousness that God desires. And the verse that follows it immediately says, therefore, get rid of all moral filth and the evil that is so prevalent, and humbly accept the word of God planted in you, which can save you. And then verse 22 emphasizes the outworking of this means that we are not to be merely listeners to the word. Don't deceive yourselves in thinking that just listening is enough. You have to do what it says, do what it tells you to do. And lastly, that great chapter 1 of James closes off and encapsulates this call to compassion by saying this way of living, this type of religion, is the type that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless. And it looks like this: to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself from being polluted by the world. So this teaches us to maintain purity, righteousness, but underpin it all with a sense of compassion for the vulnerable and those in distress. You know, friends, there are to be or not to be, to allow or not to allow. There are definitely things that we should never allow in our lives, things such as sin and wickedness, but there are also things that we should always include, such as obedience to the Lord, holiness, and compassion for all of those who are in need. Thanks for being with me today. You've been with me, friends, as we've been going through the book of Deuteronomy. You'll know I've suggested, along with many commentators, that Moses is in fact revisiting the Ten Commandments in this whole middle section, the sermon he gives the people in the book of Deuteronomy. Sometimes the connection is very clear for us to see, other times less so. And when we come today to the second half of Deuteronomy, we're looking at Deuteronomy 23 verses 19 to 25, we see Moses give several commands that at first glance may seem unrelated to the commandments. However, many commentators have recognized that he is in fact addressing the 8th commandment in the passage we're going to look at today, which is, "Thou shalt not steal." Now, if we're reading Exodus 20 this way, as the application of the commandments, and in this case the 8th commandment, it seems pretty straightforward. For us today, it may mean just simply that we shouldn't steal. We shouldn't burgle people's houses. We shouldn't steal from anybody else. We shouldn't even steal from institutions by not paying bills or by, for example, shoplifting. But in Deuteronomy, Moses includes these additional instructions which many say relate to this commandment. And many would also say, well, they don't on the surface immediately appear to connect to the 8th commandment. So the question I'm asking today is, how does Moses apply these commandments and link them back to the 8th commandment, "Thou shalt not steal"? That's what we're going to do today. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, friends, you've heard my thesis, what I believe is going on here in this passage. One commentator I read in preparation for the study that we're doing today offered what I believe is a helpful insight, stating that the laws from Deuteronomy 23 verse 19 to 25 are those that relate to the 8th of the 10 commandments, "Thou shalt not steal," because they all have a connection relating to the respecting of the possessions of others. That commentary suggests that Moses is addressing what rightly belongs to others and how you should behave towards people with honesty and be fair towards people, not just with their possession, but in your attitude of your possessions towards them. So let's explore and see how I believe Moses applies this 8th commandment on a community societal level, as he will do here today. So we begin, first 2 verses, Deuteronomy 23, 19 and 20 says, "Do not charge a fellow Israelite interest, whether on money or food or anything else that may earn interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but not a fellow Israelite, so that the Lord your God may bless you in everything and put in your hand in the land that you are entering to possess." Now, like today, there were situations where interest rates, particularly in the ancient world, were exorbitant, especially outside the principles laid down here by the nation of Israel. Now, while it might seem that Moses is simply advising against charging high interest rates, particularly to fellow Israelites, a deeper examination reveals that there is both the negative prohibition, but some positive principles are going to be suggested in how God's people, well, the motivation should be that they should be gracious in their financial arrangements with others, and in every way, in fact. Now, looking at what we've been through in the Pentateuch so far, the first 5 books of the Bible, we were already told way back in Exodus chapter 22, let me quote it for you, verses 25 to 27. "If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not treat it like a business deal. Charge no interest. If you take your neighbor's coat as a pledge, return it at sunset, because that cloak is the only covering your neighbor has. What else can they sleep in? When they cry out to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate." So here it's explicitly stated, and we can tell from the context of the text, that the borrower in this occasion is poor. And it's saying that if the collateral on this occasion is a cloak, a garment, it must be returned by nightfall. The reason is that God is gracious and he expects his people to be the same to one another. And this poor guy should not be put in a position where he's out in the cold without his cloak overnight. Very soon, later, in Leviticus 25, in the giving of the law, we also see something similar said. Verses 35 to 37 says, "If any of your fellow Israelites become poor and are unable to support themselves among you, help them as you would a foreigner and a stranger, so that they can continue to live among you. Do not take interest or any profit from them, but fear your God, so that they may continue to live among you. You must not lend them money at interest or sell them food as profit." So again, in Leviticus, we see the connection here is to be generous, particularly in the face of poverty. That aspect of it is pretty explicit here. And in this situation, we see a fellow Israelite who's fallen into poverty. And the inference here is that you must help them, and without charging interest or making a profit out of this situation. The motivation for this is also disclosed as coming from a place out of a reverence for God, and the fact that you can remember his delivery of you out of poverty, the poverty of slavery. Importantly, the Lord in this passage emphasizes that he is their God. He reminds them he's the one that has brought you out of Egypt and Canaan. He was gracious to them as a people, to them individually, and he now wants you to reflect that in being gracious to others. Additionally, we see that no interest should be taken from a poor person. How different is that to the world in which we live today? God's generosity is seen here to serve as the plumb line, the example. Thus, even in Deuteronomy 23, the command not to charge interest is still rooted in the idea about being gracious and generous, just as God has been to us. Now, this is not the first time this theme has been explored at some depth already in this book. You may remember earlier in Deuteronomy chapter 15. Well, let me read a section for you. This was dealt with in verses 7 to 11 of that chapter for the first time. It said this: "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land that the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. Be careful not to harbor wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for cancelling debt, is near, so that you do not show ill will towards the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. They may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. So give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land, therefore I command you to be open-handed towards your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land." So Moses again is here instructing the Israelites not to harden their heart, and not to do that especially of the year of Jubilee approaches, when debts are forgiven. Some might be tempted not to lend money in the knowledge that very soon, within a year or two, those debts should be commanded by God to be forgiven, and they wouldn't have a chance to profit out of it. The fear of losing money, or the potential fear of the loss of money, should not in any way prevent God's people from lending to the poor. God promises to bless them if they do that in all their works, if they are generous and they simply trust in him. Now, this teaching is moving beyond just being gracious because God is gracious, to actually implying that in doing so, in trusting in God in this way, we are actually obeying his commandments. And there's the added benefit added in that we will receive God's blessing for living that way. So Moses here is beginning in Deuteronomy to go way beyond the rigid commandments of the law revealed early. He's starting to appeal to the Israelites' hearts, to their conscience and their hearts of compassion. So this law of debt cancellation, which was mentioned here in Deuteronomy 15, the year of Jubilee, was actually meant to instill and imbibe within the whole community a spirit of generosity, with Israelites being freed up from the potential to develop an unhealthy interest in money, the love of money and stuff. But ironically, with the year of Jubilee approaching, it acknowledges that people might be tempted to be tight-fisted instead of open-handed, as it beautifully describes it. Therefore, it's positioned that a calculating Israelite who is refusing to lend to a brother out of fear of it not either being repaid or the debt having to be cancelled altogether quite soon is actually suggesting here that that attitude means you're guilty of sinning, because ultimately it's showing a lack of trust in the Lord. The promise underpinning all this, that he will bless those who do this, will bless the work of their hands, is the way it's positioned, which is interesting. Now, Solomon would also later write on this quite extensively in the book of Proverbs. One example of that is Proverbs 11:24, which says, "One man gives freely, yet gains even more. Another withholds unduly, but comes to poverty." Proverbs 19 verse 17 also tells us, "Whoever is kind to the poor lends to the Lord, and he will reward them for what they have done." Think about this. What it's saying is when you lend money to the poor without charging interest, as Moses has instructed here in Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, you are essentially lending to the Lord, it says. And the promise is that by doing that, well, it's the Lord himself who will repay you. And Proverbs 28:8 also warns against this principle of withholding, being tight-fisted, or charging excessive interest. It says one who increases his possessions by usury and extortion doesn't benefit from it, but rather God gathers it for him who has pity upon the poor. So again, this is likely referring to trying to head off those who are motivated to charge exorbitant interest rates and take advantage of people's financial struggles. And the implication is clear, that such ill-gotten gains, and I would suggest when even allowed on a societal level, will never benefit those who are not generous in their attitude towards the poor and try and exploit people in this way. So these proverbs are all reinforcing the idea that generosity actually ultimately leads to blessing, and withholding generosity leads to lack in the life of the person who does it. So all of this echoes the principles laid out here in the passage we're looking at today in Deuteronomy, but further illustrate the importance of ultimately being motivated out of compassion for the poor of doing this, and in the knowledge that we can trust in God for his provision in all things. So if I were to summarize the lessons from across the whole Pentateuch, from Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy here, as well as the later Proverbs, we learn very clearly that the Israelites are commanded. The application of the law of the eighth commandment is give to the poor without worrying about it, lend money willingly to the poor, expecting nothing back and not charging disadvantaged interest rates, and ultimately trust God for blessing you in his work. You see, charging interest, if you think about it, when lending to the poor, ultimately just worsens the condition. It's just mathematics, isn't it? And it actually has the added disadvantage of potentially feeding any lender's sinful attitude towards greed, causing them to be in a more serious negative spiritual situation by going that route. It's kind of like a doctor choosing to charge his own children for any treatment that he gives. The underlying message here is that that type of selfishness, covetousness, leads to ruin, not just within the individual or the family, but across the whole society, while generosity across the society means that ultimately God's fairness and justice can prevail. Okay, that's the first of these applications, commandments for unpacking the law. In Deuteronomy 23, the next couple of verses 21 to 23, we see it being widened out to concern the making of vows to the Lord. How's that connected, I wonder? Let's see what it says. If you make a vow to the Lord your God, do not be slow to repay it, for the Lord your God will certainly demand it of you, and you will be guilty of sin. But if you refrain from making a vow, you will not be guilty. But whatever your lips utter, you must do, because you made your vow freely to the Lord your God with your own mouth. So here Moses emphasizes the seriousness of what are called making of vows towards people, but vows before God or towards God as well. And it says, once you make a vow, you must fulfill it, and without delay, as a failure to do so is considered stealing from God. However, making a vow is also clearly presented as something voluntary. So if you choose not to make a vow, you're not sinning. But once you do make a vow, if you choose to do so, and you must honor it as promptly as you're able. Proverbs again 20:25 also taught and warned in this area, and it said, it is a snare for a man to devote himself rashly to something as holy and afterward to reconsider his vows. So this proverb also highlights the danger of making these sorts of impulsive vows and promises and then failing to fulfill them. And also in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, we hear the same sentiment echoed, where it says, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. He has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have owed. Better not to vow than to vow and not to pay. So it's actually the same, isn't it? Clear guidelines in our attitude towards vows, promises that we make to the Lord. Because by not paying them, we are robbing God of what is due. Okay, the final commandment in today's passage deals with this issue about respecting your neighbor's property. It says this, if you enter your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat all the grapes you want, but do not put any in your basket. If you enter or pass through your neighbor's cornfield, you may pick the ears with your hand, but you must not take a sickle to their standing corn. So this command allows for the principles of generosity and hospitality. You see, permitting a person to eat their fill from your, or if you're the case and you're passing through a neighbour's vineyard or grain field, that is allowed. However, it prohibits you from taking more that you can eat on the spot. The underlying principle is to respect your neighbour's property and not take advantage of their generosity, and anybody passing through may be able to be sustained on their journey. Now, this concept we saw practiced by Jesus' disciples. In Matthew 12, we saw them passing through a field and they pluck heads of grain while they're walking through the field. Now, they're criticized by the Pharisees for doing this, particularly on the Sabbath, but clearly we see here that this act was indeed absolutely allowed, permissible, according to the Mosaic law. But let me just clarify, these commands that we've looked at today, all three of them, remember, prohibiting interest on loans to the poor, requiring the prompt fulfillment of vows, and then finally here, respecting your neighbour's property. They're all expressions of that broader principle rooted in the 8th commandment, you shall not steal. They emphasize generosity, trust in God's provision, and respect for other belonging. And you can see that by adhering to these commands in this ways, the Israelites would be reflecting God's character and thereby creating a just and compassionate community based upon what are revealed here as wider, if you like, societal application of that basic commandment not to steal. So in summary, we see that the ancient Israelites were not instructed not to steal from the poor, which is what the charging with excessive interest would be, not to steal from the Lord, in the fact of not fulfilling a vow or a promise made to the Lord, and not to steal from their neighbours, in the way just described here. Instead, everyone was to be gracious and generous to one another. So if you understand how these laws in fact do relate to the 8th commandment, you can understand that how not paying the Lord is in fact stealing from him, and how taking too much from a neighbour's vineyard or field is stealing from them, or lending to the poor with the motivation of making excessive money from them is stealing from the poor. But beyond these prohibitions, the passage is also teaching us the positive application of the command. Because behind do not steal lies the underlying principles about being gracious and generous to one another, with the added promises that if we live that way and choose to live that way, the Lord will bless us. So in addition to the actions that are described and prescribed here in Leviticus 25, There are motives embedded behind these laws, we discover. In Leviticus 25, we've looked at today, the Israelites were simply told to fear the Lord and follow his commandments, and to remember and do all these things because he's delivered them from Egypt and given them this opportunity to live in a land of great blessing. And if people obey the Lord still today, the promise still stands, I believe, that he will bless them. So if you think through what Moses is teaching, it's not really about charging interest or all these other things. It's about understanding the deeper motives behind everything we choose to do. And it all goes back to being godlike, acting with generosity and grace, just as God does. Now, the New Testament will continue this theme as it works through it. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 28 says, "Let him who steal no more. Rather, let him labor that he may have something to give." So this highlights the fact that it's not just about stealing, but it is also about the application of using what God has given you to bless others. The principle is seen throughout the Bible. In fact, it started with God's promise to Abraham in Genesis to bless him so that his descendants could be blessed, so that they could bless the world. And as children of Abraham and as followers of the Lord in the New Testament, we saw Peter and others emphasize this by commanding us to never render curses upon other people, but always to try and offer the blessings of the Lord. So this principle is not just about not being a thief, about avoiding stealing things. It is more about being generous and gracious to others. And here we go. When you do so, there's a promise that God will bless you and bless you in a way that you can even be more generous to others. So this leads me to conclude today by just confirming that through the teachings of Jesus himself, as revealed in Luke chapter 6, his version of the Sermon on the Mount, where he says we should be generous and gracious because God has been generous and gracious to us. Probably the high point of all teaching of this is indeed found within this passage. So I'd like to close today by reading for you Luke chapter 6, verses 32 to 36, where we hear Jesus say this: "If you love those who love you, what credit is that for you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good for you, what credit is that for you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive back interest, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much back as they can. Instead, love your enemies, do good, and lend, hoping for nothing in return. And then your reward will be great, and you will be the sons and daughters of the Most High. For he is kind to the unthankful and evil. Therefore be merciful, just as your Father was also merciful to you." So the message is clear. On the surface, it says do not steal, but underneath it's underpinned by the commandment to be generous and gracious and trust the God that blesses you, even though you at the time he blessed you by offering you his son to die on a cross, you neither knew nor cared. You were unthankful and evil in the world before you even recognized that. And when you take that comprehensive approach to this simple basic commandment, then you see it encompasses not just other person's material possessions, but it extends towards embodying God's generosity and mercy in all our actions and using to good utility anything he has chosen to give to us. And by doing so, we in fact align our lives and our character with God's character and principles, and we live out the fullness of his command, this command today, in our daily lives. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, people, I'll leave it there today. Thanks for being with me. We'll return tomorrow and continue on our journey together through the book of Deuteronomy. do hope you're finding it helpful in its application. Can I remind you that we've been 3 years into this journey working through the whole Bible, and if you've not made the decision to make the study of the Bible part of your everyday life, then the opportunity is to do that now by simply subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you are finding it helpful, why not consider recommending it or sharing it to a friend who can join us on this amazing journey, Lord willing, which will take us through from Genesis to Revelation. In a couple of weeks, we'll be going back into the New Testament, into the book of Acts. With that said, we'll leave it there today. You can reach out and connect to me either through where the podcast is hosted on Patreon, or you can become part of the community and it is over there you can also become part of the community who follows me. You don't have to make a financial commitment to do that, but by doing that, you'll have full access to an early ad-free version of the podcast and also lots of teaching resources around it. And you can also reach out and connect to me there. So thanks for being with me today, and I'll see you back here again tomorrow, I trust, on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.